The courtroom fell silent the moment the slap echoed across the polished wooden walls. Valerie Underwood didn't raise her hand to defend herself. She didn't shout. She didn't even look back. Across the aisle, Lena Whitmore lowered her hand slowly, satisfied. A few people gasped. Someone whispered. And Austin Underwood, Valerie's husband, simply watched. For a brief second, a faint smile crossed his face. What none of them realized was that the man seated high above them on the bench, the judge presiding over the case, was Judge Nathaniel Underwood, Valerie's brother. And in this courtroom, silence never meant ignorance. Sometimes, it meant the truth was about to arrive. If stories about dignity, justice, and quiet strength matter to you, stay with this one until the very end. And before we continue, tell me something in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Stories like this travel far, but justice always feels personal. If you believe that truth deserves to be heard, even when it begins in silence, consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss the next story. Now, let's begin. Valerie Underwood had always believed that silence could be a form of discipline. Not the kind of silence that came from fear, not the kind that avoided truth, but the kind that allowed a person to watch carefully before deciding what something really meant. At 35, Valerie lived in a quiet neighborhood in Naperville, a western suburb of Chicago known for its tidy lawns, calm streets, and carefully maintained routines. The houses there looked reassuringly similar: white fences, trimmed hedges, two-car garages. It was the sort of place where neighbors waved politely but rarely asked personal questions. From the outside, the life Valerie shared with her husband appeared orderly and stable. Austin Underwood owned a mid-sized construction company called Underwood, contracting a business that had grown steadily over the past decade. His company handled municipal renovation projects, commercial developments, and occasionally government contracts around Cook County. The company's logo appeared on trucks that could often be seen parked outside job sites throughout Chicago's western suburbs. Austin liked to say he had built the company from the ground up. What he rarely mentioned was that Valerie had quietly handled most of the company's financial systems during its earliest years, long before they could afford professional accountants. Numbers had always been Valerie's language. She worked as a financial analyst for a consulting firm in downtown Chicago, spending most weekdays inside a tall glass building overlooking the Chicago River. Her days were structured around reports, forecasts, and the careful interpretation of financial patterns. Colleagues described her as calm and precise. She rarely spoke during meetings unless she had something worth saying. And when she did speak, people usually listened. 9 years earlier, when Valerie married Austin, she believed she understood the life they were building. Austin was ambitious, energetic, sometimes impulsive. But she had always assumed those qualities were balanced by the stability they were creating together. For years, nothing seemed unusual, until small details began to shift. The first change was subtle. Austin started coming home later than usual. Construction projects often required unpredictable hours, so at first, Valerie didn't question it. Delays happened. Contractors called meetings. Equipment problems appeared without warning. But gradually, the explanations became shorter, less specific. Sometimes Austin arrived home after midnight and offered only a vague sentence about a late meeting with suppliers. Sometimes he didn't explain at all. Another change appeared in his phone habits. Austin had never been particularly secretive with his devices before. His phone had often been left on the kitchen counter or the living room table while he showered or stepped outside. Now it rarely left his hand. When it did, it was placed face down, always face down. Valerie noticed the pattern, the way she noticed financial irregularities, quietly without reacting. She simply stored the observation away. Weeks passed. Then, one evening, while reviewing household expenses, Valerie noticed something else. A credit card transaction. The restaurant name was unfamiliar to her. Maison du Lac, Chicago. Valerie knew Chicago's business dining scene fairly well. Her work sometimes involved client meetings at restaurants across the city. But Maison du Lac was not a place Austin had ever mentioned. The charge was large enough to suggest a dinner for two people ordering expensive wine. Valerie looked at the date. Tuesday. Austin had told her he was meeting subcontractors that night. She did not confront him. Instead, she opened the digital credit statement and downloaded the monthly report. It was a habit she had developed long ago. When something didn't feel clear, Valerie preferred to see the entire pattern before asking questions. One transaction meant very little. A pattern meant everything. She continued reviewing. Another unfamiliar charge appeared 2 weeks earlier. A boutique hotel in downtown Chicago. The amount covered an overnight stay. Austin had told her that evening he was working late on a proposal and might sleep at the office. Valerie didn't react. She simply downloaded the statement. Then another month. More charges appeared. Restaurants, hotels, gifts purchased at luxury stores on Michigan Avenue. Some were small enough to avoid immediate suspicion. But when viewed together, they formed a quiet trail. Valerie opened a spreadsheet. She entered each transaction. Date, location, amount. Her work required building models that could identify financial irregularities hidden inside complex data sets. The process had become instinctive. Patterns emerged quickly. Certain charges occurred on weekday evenings when Austin had claimed to be meeting clients. Other charges occurred on weekends when he said he was visiting job sites. Valerie compared those dates with Austin's construction schedules. Several projects he mentioned did not require evening work at all. She sat back in her chair. For a long moment, she simply watched the numbers on the screen. There were many possible explanations. Business entertainment, client meetings, company expenses temporarily placed on personal cards, but something about the timing didn't align. Austin's company already had a corporate account for business dining. These expenses had not been submitted through it. They were entirely separate. Valerie closed the spreadsheet. In the kitchen, she could hear the dishwasher humming softly. Outside, a car passed along the quiet suburban street. The house felt calm, almost too calm. When Austin returned home that night, Valerie was sitting at the kitchen island reading a report from work. He walked in with the restless energy he often carried after long days. "Still working?" he asked casually. Valerie glanced up. "Just finishing something." Austin opened the refrigerator and poured himself a drink. He talked about a construction delay at a downtown project, something about permit approvals, something about subcontractors missing deadlines. The explanation flowed easily. Valerie listened, not interrupting, not challenging, only observing. Austin spoke confidently, but there was a slight difference in his rhythm. Small pauses where there had never been pauses before. People often believed lies were difficult to detect because they sounded convincing. In Valerie's experience, the opposite was true. Truth usually arrived without rehearsal. Austin finished his drink and headed upstairs. Valerie remained seated at the island long after he left the room. Later that night, after the house was quiet, she opened her laptop again. This time, she logged into the household banking system. Several accounts were shared between them. But Valerie noticed something interesting. A recent transfer. $10,000 had moved from Austin's personal savings account into another account she did not recognize. The account name appeared only as Unoutside Holdings, LLC. Valerie had never heard of that company. She clicked the transaction details. The receiving account belonged to a bank in downtown Chicago. Her eyes remained calm as she read the information. Again, there were many possible explanations. Austin might have created a new subsidiary for business purposes. Companies often formed small holding entities to manage project funds. But if that were the case, Valerie would normally have known. Austin had relied on her financial insight many times in the past. Now he had not mentioned it. She opened a new folder on her computer. The folder name was simple: Records. Inside it, She saved the credit card statements, the transfer confirmation, screenshots of the unfamiliar transactions. Valerie did not tell anyone what she had found. She did not speak to friends. She did not call her brother. Instead, she returned to her routine the next morning as if nothing had changed. At work, she completed her reports. At home, she prepared dinner. When Austin spoke, she listened politely. But inside her mind, a new process had begun. Valerie Underwood had spent her career analyzing financial behavior, and what she had seen so far suggested only one thing. This story was not going to end with a simple explanation. And Valerie knew something else too. If the truth was going to surface, it would need more than suspicion. It would need evidence. Long before Valerie Underwood ever sat in a courtroom before lawyers and financial records and quiet accusations began to shape the direction of her life, there had always been one person in her family who understood the weight of evidence better than anyone else. Her brother, Nathaniel Underwood. To most people in Illinois legal circles, the name carried a certain gravity. Judge Nathaniel Underwood had built a reputation over 2 decades that was almost austere in its consistency. Lawyers who appeared in his courtroom often described the same experience. He was calm, measured, and almost impossible to manipulate. He rarely raised his voice. He almost never interrupted. And he had an unusual habit of letting attorneys speak longer than they expected, just long enough for them to reveal more than they intended. Nathaniel believed that truth often appeared when people were given enough space to expose it themselves. The newspapers occasionally called him one of the most disciplined legal minds in the Midwest. Nathaniel himself disliked that description. In his view, discipline wasn't exceptional. It was simply necessary. He had learned that lesson very early. The Underwood family had not grown up surrounded by privilege. Their childhood home had been a narrow brick house on the south side of Chicago where winters felt especially long and the city's noise rarely stopped. Their father, Michael Underwood, had served for 32 years in the Chicago Police Department. Their mother, Eleanor Underwood, had taught American history at a public high school. Between them, the household had been structured around 2 simple principles. Facts mattered, and responsibility mattered even more. Nathaniel, 12 years older than Valerie, had taken those principles seriously from the time he was young. He was the type of child who read quietly in the living room while other kids played outside. When he eventually left for law school, no one in the family was surprised. When he later became a federal prosecutor known for dismantling financial fraud networks across Illinois, the same pattern continued. Nathaniel rarely spoke dramatically about justice. He simply worked. Years later, when he was appointed to the federal bench, colleagues predicted he would become one of the most respected judges in the circuit. They were correct. But inside the Underwood family, Nathaniel remained exactly what he had always been. Valerie's older brother. Their relationship had always been steady rather than expressive. Nathaniel was not the kind of man who called every week just to chat. His work consumed most of his time, and when he did speak, his words were careful. Yet Valerie had always known something important. Nathaniel paid attention, even when he said nothing. When Valerie married Austin 9 years earlier, Nathaniel had attended the ceremony, quietly standing near the back of the small church in Naperville. He shook Austin's hand, congratulated them both, then returned to his usual reserve. Nathaniel never interfered in Valerie's personal life. He understood the importance of boundaries, especially given his position in the legal system. Judges avoided personal entanglements that might one day appear inside a courtroom. But Nathaniel observed, Austin Underwood had impressed most people easily. He was energetic, charismatic, and confident in the way many successful entrepreneurs were. Nathaniel had noticed something else. Austin spoke quickly, often about ambition, rarely about responsibility. It was not enough to form a judgment, but it was enough for Nathaniel to remember. Years passed. Nathaniel watched from a distance as Austin's construction company expanded across the Chicago suburbs. Municipal contracts began appearing under the company's name. New trucks, new employees, new projects. Valerie seemed content. That was enough for Nathaniel, until small details began reaching him indirectly. Sometimes those details came through professional circles. Chicago's business and legal communities overlapped more than people realized. One afternoon, nearly a year before the divorce filing, Nathaniel attended a legal conference downtown. During a break between panels, he found himself speaking with an attorney who specialized in municipal contracting disputes. They discussed several recent cases involving construction companies accused of mishandling project funds. The attorney mentioned a familiar name. Underwood Contracting, he said casually. They've been bidding on several public renovations lately. Nathaniel nodded. Yes, he said. My brother-in-law runs that company. The attorney raised an eyebrow. Small world. Nathaniel didn't ask further questions. He simply noted the context. Months later, another quiet observation reached him. This time, through his sister. Valerie rarely complained about anything in her life. Their conversations were usually brief and practical: holidays, family gatherings, occasional work updates. But during one phone call late in the evening, Nathaniel noticed something different. Valerie paused more often than usual. Nathaniel didn't ask directly. Instead, he said, "Work keeping you busy?" "Yes," Valerie answered. Another pause. Nathaniel recognized the rhythm. Something had shifted. But Valerie did not elaborate, and Nathaniel did not press. Both of them understood the same rule their parents had taught long ago. No one could solve a problem without first deciding to face it. If Valerie needed help, she would say so. Until then, Nathaniel respected her independence. Still, the judge in him noticed patterns. Several months later, another detail crossed his path. A civil case involving construction subcontractors appeared on his docket for preliminary review. The dispute did not directly involve Austin's company, but it referenced several contractors working within the same network. Nathaniel scanned the documents briefly. Underwood Contracting appeared in a background reference. Not accused, not involved, just mentioned. Nathaniel closed the file. But the name remained in his mind. Nathaniel was not suspicious by nature. He was methodical, and methodical people rarely ignored patterns once they began appearing. Meanwhile, Valerie had already started her own quiet investigation inside her home. What Nathaniel didn't know yet was how carefully his sister had begun documenting the financial irregularities surrounding Austin's activities. He did not know about the spreadsheet she had built, or the folder labeled "Records Stored on Her Computer." He did not know that Valerie had already noticed the hidden account, the unfamiliar transactions, the dinners Austin never explained. But Nathaniel did know one thing about his sister that many people overlooked. Valerie Underwood was patient. She did not confront problems emotionally. She studied them. Nathaniel had seen that quality since she was a teenager. Once, when Valerie was 15, she discovered that a teacher had miscalculated final exam grades for several students. Instead of complaining publicly, Valerie spent an entire evening reviewing the grading system and preparing a detailed explanation. The next day, she presented the teacher with the evidence. Calmly, the grades were corrected. Nathaniel remembered that moment clearly. Valerie had never been interested in winning arguments. She was interested in accuracy. That same discipline was now unfolding quietly inside her life again. Neither Nathaniel nor Austin fully understood it yet, but Valerie had already begun assembling something far more powerful than suspicion. Evidence. And once evidence existed, the truth rarely stayed hidden for long. The name appeared for the first time on a Thursday evening. Valerie Underwood had been reviewing a set of archived emails that Austin had once asked her to help organize months earlier. The messages were stored inside a shared backup folder connected to the company's internal server, something Austin had set up long before his business had grown large enough to hire a full administrative staff. Most of the messages were ordinary. Construction schedules, supplier invoices, contract discussions. Valerie wasn't searching for anything specific at first. She was simply studying patterns the same way she would examine financial records when something seemed inconsistent. Then one name appeared repeatedly: Lena Whitmore. At first, the emails looked completely professional. Subject lines about marketing proposals, client presentations, budget discussions for promotional materials. Lena Whitmore was listed as Director of Marketing for Underwood Contracting, a position Austin had mentioned hiring for about a year earlier when the company began expanding its public project portfolio. Marketing had never been Austin's strength. Valerie remembered him saying he needed someone who understood branding and municipal proposal presentation strategies. That alone was not unusual. But the tone of the emails changed gradually. The earliest messages between Austin and Lena were formal, short, professional. Then over time, the language shifted. Subject lines remained about work, but the messages inside them began to include casual comments. A joke about a meeting running late. A remark about grabbing dinner after a long day at the office. Then emojis appeared. Small details that might have meant nothing individually. But Valerie had learned long ago that patterns were rarely accidental. She opened several of the most recent messages. One message arrived at 11:42 p.m. Austin, still at the office. That presentation turned out better than expected. You deserve credit. Lena, only if you're buying dinner next time. The next message came just minutes later. Austin deal. Valerie sat quietly at the dining room table reading without emotion. Another message thread appeared 2 weeks later. This time, the exchange was shorter. Lena reservation confirmed. Same place as last time. Austin perfect. Valerie recognized the restaurant name immediately. Maison du Lac, the same restaurant that had appeared on the credit card statement she had reviewed days earlier. She leaned back slightly in her chair. This was no longer a vague suspicion. It was a connection. Valerie opened a document and began recording information. Dates, times, email subjects. She downloaded copies of the conversations and saved them into the records folder on her laptop. Still, emails alone were not proof of an affair. Professional colleagues often shared meals after work. Business relationships sometimes looked personal to outside observers. Valerie knew better than to jump to conclusions. She continued reading. Over the next few weeks of archived communication, the tone between Austin and Lena became unmistakably familiar. Their emails included private jokes, comments about late evenings spent reviewing proposals. Once Lena wrote, "You work too hard. Someone should remind you to take a break." Austin replied, "Maybe you already are." Valerie closed the message. The house around her remained quiet. Upstairs, Austin was watching television. The sound drifted faintly through the hallway. Valerie did not confront him. Instead, she opened another email. This one contained an attachment, a marketing presentation file. The document included images from a company event held several months earlier, a small networking reception organized for potential municipal partners. Valerie studied the photos carefully. Austin appeared in several of them, standing with city officials and contractors. In one photograph, Lena Whitmore stood beside him. She looked younger than Valerie had expected, perhaps 27. Her posture was confident, her expression bright and practiced in the way people working in marketing often developed. Austin stood slightly closer to her than he did to the others. It was a small detail, but Valerie noticed it. Later that night, after Austin went to bed, Valerie opened the company's internal file system again. Construction companies relied heavily on project scheduling software that tracked employee access cards and site entries. Workers often scanned badges to enter restricted job areas or office buildings. Valerie searched for access logs related to Lena Whitmore. The data showed that Lena's office badge had been used frequently after normal working hours. Many entries occurred between 8:00 p.m. and midnight. Sometimes Austin's badge appeared within minutes of hers. Sometimes the records showed both badges leaving the office building together late at night. Valerie exported the logs, saved them, added them to the folder. Then she opened another system connected to the company parking garage. The building's security system recorded license plate entries for employees with assigned parking passes. Austin's black SUV appeared regularly. Lena's silver sedan appeared as well. On multiple evenings, the system recorded both vehicles leaving the garage within the same 5-minute window. Again, Valerie saved the records. The evidence was growing, but Valerie was not interested in proving emotional betrayal alone. What concerned her more was the financial pattern she had already discovered. Yes, if Austin was spending large amounts of money outside their shared accounts, the purpose behind those transactions mattered. And the connection between Lena and the hidden account A, Holdings LLC, remained unexplained. The next afternoon, Valerie drove into downtown Chicago for work. Her office building overlooked the river, its glass exterior reflecting the cloudy spring sky. Inside her office, she closed the door and reopened the spreadsheet she had been building. She added new columns, email timestamps, restaurant reservations, parking records. As the information filled the rows, a clear timeline began to form. Austin and Lena had started communicating casually about 10 months earlier. 6 months later, the credit card charges began appearing. 4 months after that, the hidden bank transfers appeared. The progression looked organized, deliberate. Valerie studied the pattern carefully. Then she noticed something new. Several large transactions from the hidden account had been transferred not only to Lena, but also to a property management company in downtown Chicago. Valerie searched the company name. The address led to a recently renovated luxury apartment building near the river. High-end units, private parking, long-term leases available for corporate clients. Valerie sat very still. The transfer amount matched the standard deposit required for a 2-bedroom unit in that building. It appeared Austin had already paid several months of rent, which meant one thing. Austin was not simply having an affair. He was preparing a new life. Valerie closed the browser window slowly. For a long time, she stared at the spreadsheet on her screen. 9 years of marriage, hundreds of shared memories, conversations, plans. And somewhere inside that timeline, Austin had quietly started building something separate. Valerie did not cry. She did not slam the laptop shut. Instead, she opened a new document and typed one simple title at the top of the page: Timeline. Then she began writing. Every email, every financial transfer, every suspicious movement connected to Austin and Lena Whitmore. By the time the office lights dimmed that evening, the document had grown to several pages. Valerie saved the file. Then she sat quietly for a moment before leaving work. Outside, Chicago traffic moved steadily across the bridges. People walked quickly along the sidewalks, absorbed in their own lives. Valerie watched them briefly through the window. Then she turned away, because she already understood something important. The truth about Austin and Lena was no longer a question. It was simply a matter of time before the full picture appeared. And Valerie Underwood had never been afraid of time. The financial trail did not appear dramatic at first. It was quiet, technical, hidden inside ordinary transactions that most people would have overlooked completely. But Valerie Underwood had spent more than a decade studying financial behavior. She understood something many people never realized: money almost always told the truth, even when people tried to hide it. 3 days after discovering the apartment deposit linked to a Holdings LLC, Valerie returned to the spreadsheet she had been building. The document now contained several dozen entries. Each one connected a financial transaction, an email exchange, or a movement pattern between Austin Underwood and Lena Whitmore. Still, Valerie felt there was a larger structure behind it, something more organized than a simple affair. So she began examining the source of the money itself. Austin's construction company had grown rapidly over the last 5 years. Several municipal contracts had helped expand the business, especially renovation projects connected to county buildings and transportation infrastructure. Those contracts involved large budgets. Large budgets required detailed accounting. Valerie still had partial access to the early financial systems she had helped design when the company first started. Austin had eventually hired outside accountants, but the historical records remained archived on older servers. Late one evening, while Austin attended what he described as a contractor meeting, Valerie opened those records again. Her process was systematic. First, she examined the company's corporate accounts. Then she compared them with Austin's personal accounts. Then she checked the newly discovered account, A Holdings LLC. The connection appeared gradually. Several months earlier, small transfers had begun moving from the company's operational account into Austin's personal account. The amounts were not large individually. $5,000, $7,000, sometimes $10,000. In a business handling multi-million-dollar construction projects, those numbers could easily disappear inside routine operating expenses. But the timing was unusual. The transfers occurred shortly after specific municipal project payments arrived. Valerie traced the sequence carefully. City payment, company account, Austin's personal account, A Holdings LLC. Then from A Holdings LLC, the money split into two directions. One portion moved into Lena Whitmore's personal account. Another portion paid recurring expenses tied to the downtown apartment. Valerie sat quietly as she mapped the sequence. This was no longer a question of infidelity. Austin appeared to be redirecting company funds, possibly even municipal project funds. That distinction mattered enormously. Misusing corporate profits during a divorce could become a civil dispute, but mishandling government contract money could become something much more serious. Valerie leaned back slowly in her chair. Her mind did not jump toward anger. Instead, it began organizing the implications. If Austin had been moving money from municipal project payments, the records would exist in multiple places. City contract payment schedules, company accounting logs, bank transfer confirmations, all of it traceable. Valerie opened another file and began documenting each connection. The numbers aligned almost perfectly with Austin's new relationship timeline. Around the same time Lena's emails became more personal, the transfers began. The pattern continued month after month. Valerie noticed something else. Several transactions from A Holdings LLC had purchased luxury items, designer handbags, high-end jewelry stores on Michigan Avenue. One receipt listed a bracelet worth nearly $12,000. The purchase date matched Lena's birthday, according to the employee records Valerie had accessed earlier. Valerie recorded the transaction, saved the invoice, added it to the growing evidence folder. Outside the window, the suburban street remained quiet. The house looked peaceful. Inside, Valerie's investigation had quietly transformed into something much larger than a marital dispute. She opened the banking interface again. This time, she looked deeper into the structure of A Holdings LLC. The company registration information was publicly available through Illinois corporate records. The entity had been formed just 8 months earlier. Registered owner, Austin Underwood. Business purpose listed vaguely as real estate and consulting services. Valerie already knew the real estate part referred to the apartment. But there was something else. One additional account connected to the LLC showed periodic transfers labeled consulting services. The receiving account belonged to Lena Whitmore. The description suggested she had been formally hired as a consultant. Valerie studied the payments carefully. Each transfer was identical. $8,000. Once per month, for 6 months. Total $48,000. Valerie opened the company's internal payroll system. Lena was already receiving a full salary as director of marketing. These additional payments had never been processed through official payroll, which meant they were not being taxed properly, and they were not reported as company expenses. Valerie typed another line into the timeline. Unreported consulting payments, Lena Whitmore. The implications were becoming clearer. Austin wasn't simply spending money on a relationship. He was constructing an entirely separate financial structure. Hidden income, hidden housing, hidden payments. For a moment, Valerie allowed herself to consider the emotional part of it. 9 years of marriage. 9 years during which she had helped stabilize Austin's company finances. 9 years of believing their shared work had built something mutual. But the feeling that surfaced inside her was not heartbreak. It was clarity. Austin had not made a sudden mistake. He had built a plan. and plans left traces. Valerie saved the updated spreadsheet and copied it onto an encrypted external drive. Then she created a second backup, stored securely in a cloud account Austin did not know existed. She understood the importance of redundancy. Evidence lost too early could never be recovered. The next evening, Austin returned home unusually late. Valerie was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing a printed report. Austin loosened his tie and poured himself a drink. "Long day," he said. Valerie nodded. "Same here." Austin took a sip and leaned against the counter. "Big marketing presentation next week," he said. Lena's been working non-stop on it. The name hung briefly in the air between them. Valerie looked up calmly. "She seems dedicated." Austin smiled slightly. "Yeah, she's good at what she does." Valerie studied him quietly. Austin appeared relaxed, confident, as if the two separate lives he was now living had settled comfortably into place. What Austin did not realize was that Valerie already understood nearly every step of that second life. The apartment, the transfers, the hidden company, all of it. Austin finished his drink and headed upstairs. Valerie remained seated at the table long after he left the room. She looked down at the printed spreadsheet. The rows of numbers formed a clear narrative now. A financial story with a beginning, a middle, and eventually a conclusion. Valerie did not know yet exactly how that conclusion would unfold, but she knew something important. Truth in financial matters rarely stayed hidden forever, especially when someone patient was already mapping the path. Valerie closed the folder slowly, because the next step in her process would require something more than observation. It would require legal preparation. And Valerie Underwood intended to be ready. The decision to speak with a lawyer did not come from anger. It came from structure. By the time Valerie Underwood scheduled her first legal consultation, the folder labeled records had grown into something far more detailed than most divorce cases ever began with. There were spreadsheets, transaction logs, email archives, security access reports, even the Illinois corporate registration documents connected to A Holdings LLC. Valerie had not rushed into this step. Nearly 6 weeks had passed since she first discovered the hidden account. During that time, she continued gathering information quietly, never allowing Austin to notice the shift in her attention. At work, she maintained her normal routine. At home, she continued their usual conversations, dinner, schedules, weekend errands. The calm exterior allowed Austin to remain comfortable. And comfort often made people careless. When Valerie finally called the law office, she chose carefully. Rachel Bennett had built a reputation in Chicago as a divorce attorney who handled complex financial cases situations where business assets, hidden income, and corporate structures often played a central role. Rachel's office sat on the 20th floor of a professional building near LaSalle Street, not far from the financial district where Valerie worked. The waiting area was quiet, furnished with dark wood and neutral colors. Large windows looked down toward the river, where the slow movement of boats contrasted with the faster rhythm of city traffic. Valerie arrived 10 minutes early. When Rachel Bennett stepped out to greet her, the attorney extended a professional but warm handshake. Rachel was in her early 40s with the composed confidence of someone who had spent years navigating emotionally complicated legal battles. "Miss Underwood," she said, "please come in." Inside the office, Rachel closed the door and gestured toward a chair. "What brings you here today?" Valerie placed a slim folder on the desk. "I believe my husband is preparing to leave our marriage," she said calmly. "And I believe he's been moving money to hide assets." Rachel had heard similar sentences many times before. But she noticed something immediately unusual. Most clients arrived with stories. Valerie arrived with documentation. "Tell me what you found," Rachel said. Valerie opened the folder and began explaining. Her voice remained steady as she described the sequence. The credit card charges, the hotel receipts, the email correspondence between Austin and Lena Whitmore, then the financial transfers. Rachel listened carefully without interrupting. When Valerie slid the spreadsheet across the desk, Rachel leaned forward slightly. This is extremely thorough, Rachel said after scanning the document. Valerie nodded once. I work in financial analysis. Rachel continued reading. Then she reached the section involving A. Holdings LLC. Rachel's eyebrows lifted slightly. And you confirmed this account is controlled by your husband? Yes. And these transfers originate from his construction company? Yes. Rachel sat back in her chair. This is important, she said. Valerie waited. In divorce cases, hidden assets are unfortunately common, Rachel continued. But if the funds originate from business accounts connected to government contracts, that could become something much larger. Valerie understood the implication. Rachel studied another document. These payments to Lena Whitmore, $8,000 per month, labeled as consulting fees. Yes. Rachel tapped the paper lightly. If she's already employed by the company, those payments could be considered unreported compensation. Rachel looked up again. And if the original money came from municipal contracts, the situation could attract federal scrutiny. Valerie remained silent. Rachel closed the folder. Have you confronted your husband about any of this? No. Rachel nodded slowly. That was wise. Rachel stood and walked toward the window briefly before returning to the desk. Here's the reality, she said. Divorce litigation involving financial concealment can become very aggressive. Your husband's attorney will likely attempt to shift the narrative. How? Valerie asked. They may claim the marriage failed because of personal incompatibility. They may attempt to portray you as emotionally distant or uninvolved. That's a common strategy. Valerie absorbed the explanation without visible reaction. Rachel leaned forward again. But the strength of your position lies here. She tapped the evidence folder. Documentation. Valerie spoke quietly. I want the process handled properly. Rachel studied her carefully. You're not looking for revenge. No. Rachel gave a small nod. That actually makes things easier. She reached for a legal pad and began outlining the next steps. First, we file for divorce citing irreconcilable differences. That's standard. Valerie nodded. Second, we request financial discovery from your husband's company. Rachel wrote another note. Third, we preserve every piece of evidence you've collected. Rachel looked up. And finally, we prepare for the possibility that this case may expand beyond divorce court if financial misconduct is confirmed. Valerie understood. The process was beginning to take shape. Rachel slid a document across the desk. This is the initial filing paperwork. Once it's submitted, your husband will be formally notified. Valerie reviewed the form briefly. Then she signed. The motion for divorce was filed the following morning in Cook County. Austin received the legal notice 2 days later. Valerie was sitting at the kitchen island when he walked into the house holding the envelope. His expression was confusion mixed with disbelief. What is this? He asked. A divorce filing, Valerie said calmly. Austin stared at her. You're serious? Yes. Austin laughed, once short and sharp. Where is this coming from? Valerie met his gaze evenly. Our marriage isn't working anymore. Austin's eyes narrowed slightly. That's it, no explanation. Valerie didn't respond. Austin set the envelope on the counter. You could have talked to me first. Valerie remained silent. Austin studied her face, searching for signs of emotion. But Valerie had already decided something important. She would not argue. Arguments revealed information. Silence protected it. Austin shook his head. This is ridiculous. He grabbed the envelope again and walked toward his office. Fine, he said over his shoulder. If you want a divorce, you'll get one. The following week, Austin hired his own attorney, Bradley Knox. Within Chicago's legal community, Knox was known for an aggressive style in family litigation. He specialized in high-conflict divorces where financial disputes often turned hostile. Rachel Bennett recognized the name immediately when she received the notice. Well, she said calmly during her next meeting with Valerie, this confirms your husband intends to fight. Valerie wasn't surprised. Rachel continued reviewing the documents. Mr. Knox is already requesting financial disclosures from your side. That's expected, Valerie replied. Rachel nodded. It is. Rachel placed the documents neatly into a folder. Now the real process begins. Valerie left the law office that afternoon and stepped onto the busy Chicago sidewalk. Traffic moved steadily along LaSalle Street. Office workers crossed intersections, carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Life continued as usual around her. But Valerie understood something clearly now. The quiet investigation she had begun inside her home had officially entered the legal system. And once that happened, the process followed rules. Evidence would be examined. Records would be reviewed. Truth would be measured against documentation. Austin still believed this divorce would be a negotiation between two people. He had not yet realized something else. Valerie Underwood had already prepared the foundation for something far more powerful than accusation. She had prepared proof. Austin Underwood did not react to the divorce filing the way many people expected. There was no immediate anger, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, he treated it like a negotiation he intended to win. During the first week after receiving the legal notice, Austin behaved almost normally at home. He continued leaving early for work, answering phone calls in his office, and occasionally mentioning construction projects the way he always had. But Valerie noticed the subtle shift in his tone. He had become more performative. His conversations sounded slightly louder, as if he were narrating events for an audience that did not exist. One evening at dinner, he said casually, "Bradley Knox thinks this case will be straightforward." Valerie continued eating without reacting. Austin leaned back in his chair. "He says most divorces come down to compromise." Valerie looked up briefly. "I'm sure he's experienced." Austin studied her expression carefully. He seemed to expect frustration or anxiety. But Valerie gave him neither. The silence unsettled him more than an argument would have. In the weeks that followed, Austin began shaping a narrative. At first, it appeared in small remarks during phone calls he made from the living room while Valerie was nearby. "She's been distant for years," he told someone one evening. Another time, he said, "You know how Valerie is always buried in spreadsheets?" The words were casual, but Valerie understood their purpose. Austin was preparing witnesses, friends, business associates, anyone who might later be asked about the condition of their marriage. He was constructing a story where Valerie appeared emotionally detached, too absorbed in work to maintain a relationship. It was a familiar tactic in divorce cases. Rachel Bennett had predicted it almost exactly. Valerie did not challenge the statements. She simply continued observing. Meanwhile, Austin's new life with Lena Whitmore was no longer particularly hidden. On several evenings, he stayed out overnight without explanation. Once, Valerie noticed a photograph posted on social media by one of Lena's friends. The image showed Lena at a rooftop bar in downtown Chicago. Austin stood beside her, one arm resting casually along the railing behind her. The caption read, "Celebrating big things ahead." Valerie saved the screenshot, not because the image proved anything legally important, but because it helped document the timeline Rachel had asked her to maintain. At the law office, Rachel Bennett was beginning the next phase of the case. Financial discovery. This stage allowed attorneys to formally request records from both parties, bank statements, company documents, tax filings, and any other material related to financial activity. Austin's lawyer, Bradley Knox, submitted the first response package 2 weeks later. Rachel reviewed the documents carefully. Then she called Valerie. "You should come by the office," Rachel said. "I want to go through something with you." When Valerie arrived, Rachel had several printed reports spread across the conference table. "These are the financial disclosures your husband's team submitted," Rachel explained. Valerie sat down. Rachel slid the first document forward. "It's incomplete." Valerie expected that. "What's missing?" she asked. "The LLC account." Valerie nodded slowly. Rachel tapped the page again. "Your husband listed his personal accounts and the primary company accounts for Underwood Contracting, but there is no mention of A. Holdings, LLC." Valerie wasn't surprised. Rachel leaned back slightly. That omission is significant. Why? Because during discovery, both parties are required to disclose all financial assets. Failing to do so can create serious consequences if the omission is later proven intentional. Valerie understood the implication immediately. Rachel folded her hands. For now, we'll continue gathering documentation quietly. Rachel opened another folder. These are the credit card statements your husband's team submitted. Valerie examined them. Several months were missing. Rachel pointed. See here, February and March statements are absent. Those were the months containing the restaurant and jewelry purchases Valerie had already documented. Rachel's voice remained calm. This is a common tactic. Provide partial records and hope the missing pieces go unnoticed. Valerie gave a small nod. They won't. Rachel smiled slightly. I suspected you'd say that. The next step involved preparing subpoenas for the banks connected to Austin's accounts. Those subpoenas would require the financial institutions to deliver complete transaction histories directly to the court. Once that happened, the records Austin had attempted to omit would appear automatically. Meanwhile, Austin continued building his public narrative. One evening, he hosted a small gathering at a restaurant near his office. Several business partners attended along with Lena Whitmore. Valerie did not attend, but the event appeared later in photos shared online. Austin and Lena stood close together in several images. In one photograph, Lena rested her hand lightly on Austin's shoulder while he laughed with another guest. The gesture was intimate, comfortable, public. Valerie added the image to her timeline. At the same time, Austin began introducing Lena more openly into his professional life. During a company presentation to potential investors, Lena appeared seated beside him at the conference table. Someone recorded a short video clip of the meeting and posted it on LinkedIn. Rachel later watched the video during one of their strategy sessions. She seems confident, Rachel remarked. Yes, Valerie replied. Rachel studied the clip. Confidence can become dangerous in situations like this. Valerie waited. Rachel continued. People who believe they've already won tend to relax their caution. A week later, Valerie experienced that phenomenon firsthand. She had driven downtown for work and stopped at a cafe near the river during her lunch break. While waiting for her coffee, she noticed two familiar figures seated at a table near the window. Austin and Lena. They were deep in conversation. Lena leaned forward, speaking quickly, while Austin listened with an amused smile. Valerie remained where she was. Neither of them had seen her yet. Lena said something that made Austin laugh. Then she reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. The gesture lasted only a second. But Valerie had already removed her phone from her purse. She took one quiet photograph, then another. Neither Austin nor Lena noticed. Valerie left the cafe without speaking. That evening, she forwarded the images to Rachel. Rachel called her an hour later. These are helpful, the attorney said. Valerie was silent. Rachel continued. Not because they prove the affair, we already know that, but because they demonstrate how openly your husband and Miss Whitmore are presenting their relationship during the divorce proceedings. Rachel paused. And that kind of public confidence often leads to mistakes. Valerie looked at the growing evidence file on her laptop. The investigation that had started with quiet financial observations had now expanded into a full legal strategy. Austin still believed the divorce would revolve around personal disagreements. But Valerie understood something different. This case was no longer about emotions. It was about documentation. And the documentation was still growing. The courthouse in downtown Chicago was already busy when Valerie Underwood arrived that morning. Cook County Court handled thousands of cases each year, and the building carried the quiet weight of countless personal stories unfolding behind its heavy doors. Lawyers moved quickly through the hallways, files tucked beneath their arms. People sat on long wooden benches waiting for hearings that could change the course of their lives. Valerie arrived early. She had always believed it was better to observe a place before becoming part of it. Her attorney, Rachel Bennett, met her near the security checkpoint and offered a calm nod. "Ready?" Rachel asked. "Yes," Valerie said. They passed through the metal detectors and entered the main hallway. The floor echoed faintly beneath the steady movement of footsteps. Today's hearing was not yet the final trial. It was a preliminary court appearance, connected to the divorce proceedings, an opportunity for both legal teams to address discovery issues and procedural matters. But Rachel had explained that these early hearings often revealed more than people expected. Courtrooms make people nervous, she had said earlier, and nervous people sometimes behave unpredictably. Valerie understood. They reached the courtroom door a few minutes later. Inside, rows of wooden benches filled the room. At the front stood the judge's bench, elevated slightly above the rest of the chamber. The American flag stood beside it, unmoving in the quiet air. Rachel and Valerie took seats near the front. Several other cases were scheduled before theirs, so the room gradually filled with lawyers, clerks, and observers waiting for their turn. Valerie kept her hands folded neatly in her lap. Across the aisle, the door opened again. Austin Underwood entered. He wore a dark blue suit and carried himself with the confident posture he often displayed during business meetings. Behind him walked his attorney, Bradley Knox, reviewing documents as they approached their seats. Austin glanced across the room. For a moment, his eyes met Valerie's. He gave a small nod. The gesture was polite, almost casual, as if they were attending a business conference rather than a legal dispute over the end of their marriage. Then the door opened again. Lena Whitmore stepped inside. Several heads turned quietly. Lena wore a tailored cream-colored jacket and carried a leather handbag that Valerie recognized from the purchase receipt she had documented months earlier. The $12,000 bracelet also rested around Lena's wrist. Lena walked directly to the row behind Austin and sat down. She crossed her legs and leaned back with the relaxed composure of someone who believed she belonged there. Rachel noticed Valerie's brief glance toward Lena. "She's not officially involved in the case," Rachel whispered, "but there's nothing preventing her from attending as an observer." Valerie nodded slightly. At the front of the room, the courtroom clerk began organizing the day's schedule. A few minutes later, the door behind the bench opened. Everyone in the room stood. The judge entered. Judge Nathaniel Underwood walked toward the bench with the calm, deliberate movement that had become familiar to attorneys across the district. His black robe moved slightly as he sat. "Be seated," he said. Valerie felt a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere the moment her brother began speaking. Nathaniel did not look toward her. His expression remained neutral, professional. There was no sign of recognition, and Valerie did not expect one. Nathaniel Underwood had spent decades building a reputation for strict judicial discipline. Personal relationships had no place inside his courtroom. Rachel had already explained that the case assignment had been random. Neither side had requested Nathaniel's courtroom, but the legal system allowed judges to remain on a case unless a formal conflict of interest was declared. Valerie had not requested one. Nathaniel began calling the first case on the docket. For nearly 40 minutes, Valerie listened as unrelated legal disputes unfolded. Contract disagreements, procedural motions, scheduling issues. Each case lasted only a few minutes before the next one began. Finally, the clerk called the name. Underwood versus Underwood. Rachel stood. Bradley Knox stood across the aisle. Austin rose beside his attorney. Valerie remained seated until Rachel gave a slight nod. Then she stood as well. Judge Nathaniel Underwood looked down at the file before him. His voice remained calm. "This matter concerns the dissolution of marriage between Valerie Underwood and Austin Underwood. Counsel, please identify yourselves for the record." Rachel spoke first. "Rachel Bennett for the petitioner, Your Honor." Bradley Knox followed. Bradley Knox representing the respondent. Nathaniel nodded once. "I understand there are discovery disputes to address." Rachel stepped forward slightly. "Yes, Your Honor. We have reason to believe certain financial records relevant to the marital assets have not been fully disclosed." Knox responded quickly. Your Honor, my client has complied with all required financial disclosures. Rachel remained composed. With respect, the submitted records appear incomplete. Nathaniel studied the documents before him. His expression revealed nothing. Behind Austin, Lena shifted slightly in her seat. Her posture carried a quiet confidence. Valerie noticed the small details. The way Lena leaned forward as Rachel spoke. The way she glanced occasionally toward Austin. Then something unexpected happened. During a brief pause in the legal discussion, Valerie stepped away from Rachel's side and moved toward the aisle. She intended to return to her seat while the attorneys continued speaking. But as she passed the row behind Austin, Lena suddenly stood. The movement happened quickly. Before anyone fully understood what was happening, Lena stepped forward. Her voice was sharp. "You think you're better than everyone, don't you?" Valerie stopped. She turned slightly. Lena's expression held a mixture of anger and confidence. Then Lena raised her hand. The slap echoed across the courtroom. The sound was loud enough to silence every conversation instantly. Valerie's head turned slightly with the impact. But she did not raise her hand. She did not speak. She simply remained standing. Gasps spread quietly through the benches behind them. Austin remained seated. For a brief moment, the corner of his mouth lifted into something that resembled a smile. Rachel stepped forward immediately. "Your Honor, but the judge's gavel struck the bench first." "Order." The single word filled the room. Nathaniel Underwood's voice remained calm, but it carried the unmistakable authority of the courtroom. Two security officers moved quickly towards Lena. She looked momentarily surprised. She provoked me." "Ma'am," one officer said firmly, "you need to step back." Valerie slowly turned and walked back toward her seat beside Rachel. Her cheeks showed the faint red outline of Lena's hand. Rachel leaned closer. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Valerie said quietly. At the bench, Judge Underwood observed the room. His expression remained completely controlled. "Any further disruption," he said evenly, "will result in immediate removal from this courtroom." Lena sat back down, her earlier confidence fading. Austin shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The courtroom slowly returned to silence. Then Nathaniel Underwood continued. "Now," he said calmly, "let us proceed with the matter before the court." What no one in the room fully understood yet was that the quiet discipline of that moment, the judge's restraint, Valerie's silence, the evidence already waiting in Rachel Bennett's files, was only the beginning. Because the truth had already entered the courtroom. And it was not leaving. The silence that followed the slap did not disappear quickly. It settled across the courtroom like a thin layer of frost, cold-controlled and impossible to ignore. Valerie Underwood sat beside Rachel Bennett without touching her cheek. The faint red mark from Lena Whitmore's hand was still visible, but Valerie did not react to it. Rachel, however, had noticed something else. The reaction of the judge. From the moment the gavel struck the bench, Judge Nathaniel Underwood's posture had remained perfectly composed. His face showed no anger, no surprise, and certainly no personal recognition. To anyone in the courtroom, he appeared exactly what he had always been. A disciplined federal judge maintaining control of his courtroom. But Rachel Bennett had spent enough years inside courtrooms to recognize subtle details. The judge had spoken quickly, decisively, and the tone of that single word, order, had carried something sharper than usual. Not emotional, but precise. Rachel leaned slightly toward Valerie. "Are you sure you're all right?" she whispered again. "Yes." Valerie's voice remained steady. Across the aisle, Bradley Knox was whispering sharply to Austin. Knox's expression suggested irritation rather than concern. Austin sat stiffly staring at the table in front of him. Behind him, Lena Whitmore appeared visibly unsettled now. The earlier confidence in her posture had faded. Courtroom security officers remained standing near the row where she sat. At the bench, Judge Underwood reviewed the case file again. His voice was calm when he spoke. "Counsel, we will continue with the scheduled matter." Rachel stood again. "Yes, Your Honor." She stepped forward. As I mentioned earlier, the petitioner believes that certain financial records connected to marital assets have not been disclosed. Bradley Knox rose immediately. Your Honor, my client has already submitted all required financial statements. Nathaniel Underwood looked down at the documents. Miss Bennett, please specify. Rachel opened a folder and removed several printed pages. These records indicate that the respondent transferred significant funds into a corporate entity called A Holdings, LLC. That entity has not been disclosed in the respondent's financial statements. Knox responded quickly. Your Honor, A Holdings is a private business entity unrelated to the marital estate. Rachel remained composed. With respect, Your Honor, the funds used to create that entity appear to originate from accounts shared during the marriage. Nathaniel listened without interruption. Valerie watched her brother carefully from the side. She knew that expression. Nathaniel was not forming opinions yet. He was gathering information. Behind Austin, Lena shifted again. She crossed her arms now, her posture defensive. Austin leaned toward Knox and whispered something. Knox nodded slightly. Then Knox addressed the bench again. Your Honor, we believe the petitioner is attempting to expand the scope of this divorce proceeding beyond what is necessary. Nathaniel spoke calmly. If the funds in question originate from marital assets, they are relevant. Knox hesitated for a fraction of a second. Rachel spoke again. Your Honor, we are requesting full financial discovery related to all accounts connected to A Holdings, LLC, including transfer records and ownership documentation. Nathaniel made a brief note on the file. Request granted. Knox's jaw tightened slightly. Rachel nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. The discussion continued for several more minutes as the court addressed scheduling matters. Throughout the entire exchange, Valerie remained silent. She did not glance toward Lena again. She did not react to Austin. She simply observed. And she noticed something important. Austin had begun to lose his earlier confidence. His shoulders were tighter now. His attention moved more frequently toward Knox. Meanwhile, Lena appeared increasingly uncomfortable under the watchful presence of the security officers still standing nearby. Eventually, Nathaniel closed the case file. This matter will proceed to further discovery. Both parties will submit the requested financial documentation within 30 days. He paused briefly. Then he added one more sentence. And let me be very clear about something. The room grew even quieter. Any attempt to conceal financial information from this court will carry serious consequences. His voice remained calm, but the meaning was unmistakable. Knox nodded stiffly. Understood, Your Honor. Rachel simply said, Yes, Your Honor. Nathaniel glanced briefly across the courtroom. For the first time during the hearing, his eyes moved in Valerie's direction. But the look lasted less than a second. No recognition, no personal acknowledgement, only the neutral observation of a judge reviewing a participant in a case. Then he looked away. The court is adjourned. The gavel struck again. People began standing immediately. Papers shuffled. Voices returned to the room. Rachel placed a hand lightly on Valerie's arm. Let's go. They walked toward the aisle. As they passed Austin's table, Knox was speaking to him quietly but urgently. Lena stood behind them, her face flushed with embarrassment. The earlier confidence she had carried into the courtroom was gone. Valerie did not look at her. Outside the courtroom doors, the hallway buzzed with the usual courthouse activity. Lawyers moved quickly between rooms. Court clerks carried stacks of files. Rachel guided Valerie toward a quieter corner near the windows. That went better than expected, Rachel said. Valerie waited. Rachel continued. The discovery order means we'll gain access to the financial records your husband tried to omit. Valerie nodded. Rachel studied her face. You handled the incident inside extremely well. Valerie understood Rachel was referring to the slap. It changed nothing, Valerie said simply. Rachel gave a small, approving smile. No, but it did reveal something. What Rachel glanced back toward the courtroom door. It revealed that the other side is losing composure. At that moment, Austin and Bradley Knox stepped into the hallway behind them. Lena followed several steps back. Austin's eyes moved toward Valerie briefly. This time, there was no confident nod, only tension. Then Knox placed a hand on Austin's shoulder and guided him toward the elevators. Lena followed quietly. Rachel watched them leave. "They're realizing something now," she said. Valerie turned toward the window, overlooking the busy Chicago street below. What Rachel's voice remained calm. "That this case isn't going the way they expected." Valerie said nothing, but inside her mind, she understood the same truth. The courtroom had only seen a small piece of the story so far. The financial records, the bank transfers, the hidden company, the recordings she had not yet revealed. All of it was still waiting. And Valerie Underwood had never rushed the moment when truth would finally appear. Because she had learned something long ago. When evidence is strong enough, time becomes an ally. 30 days passed quickly once the court issued the discovery order. In legal disputes, that period was rarely quiet. Attorneys exchanged requests, banks processed subpoenas, and accountants reviewed financial records that had previously remained hidden. For Valerie Underwood, the days were calm on the surface. She continued going to work each morning in downtown Chicago. She reviewed financial reports, attended meetings, and returned home to the same suburban house she had shared with Austin for nearly a decade. But beneath that routine, the legal process had begun moving steadily forward. Rachel Bennett's office became the center of that movement. The subpoenas sent to the banks connected with Austin's accounts had produced a large collection of documents. Boxes of printed statements arrived first, followed by digital transaction logs that extended far beyond the limited records Austin had originally submitted. Rachel called Valerie the moment the documents arrived. "You should come in," she said. "We need to go through this together." When Valerie arrived at the office, several folders were already arranged across the conference table. Rachel slid one of them forward. "This is the complete record for A Holdings, LLC." Valerie opened the folder slowly. Inside were months of bank transfers. Some of them she had already identified in her own investigation. But the official records revealed more. Rachel pointed to a column of transactions. "These deposits come directly from the operating account of Underwood Contracting." Valerie studied the numbers. Each transfer corresponded with payments made to Austin's company for municipal construction contracts. Rachel continued. Once the money reached the LLC account, it moved to two places. Valerie already knew the first, Lena Whitmore. But the second surprised even her. Rachel turned another page. "These transfers are labeled as consulting disbursements. The receiving accounts belong to several unfamiliar names." Valerie examined the amounts. $10,000, $15,000, sometimes more. "These people," Valerie said quietly, "aren't employees." Rachel nodded. "They appear to be subcontractors connected to municipal projects." Valerie understood immediately. If Austin had been paying these individuals through a private LLC rather than through official company channels, it could indicate something much larger than hidden marital assets. Rachel spoke carefully. This could suggest irregular contracting practices. Valerie remained silent. Rachel added another document to the table. "This is the most significant discovery so far." The page contained several recorded transactions between A Holdings, LLC and Lena Whitmore's account. But these were different from the earlier monthly payments. They were larger, much larger. One transfer alone totaled $120,000. Valerie's eyes moved slowly across the page. "When did this occur?" she asked. Rachel checked the date. 3 months before you filed for divorce. Valerie remembered that period clearly. It was when Austin had first begun staying overnight away from home. Rachel leaned back in her chair. "This level of financial movement will raise questions in court." Valerie closed the folder carefully. Do we know what the money was for? Rachel opened another document. This appears to be connected to the apartment lease downtown. Valerie studied the lease agreement. The luxury apartment building required a large upfront payment for long-term occupancy. Austin had paid nearly an entire year in advance. Rachel tapped the document lightly. If these funds originated from municipal project payments, the situation becomes extremely serious. Valerie understood the implication. Misusing government contract money could attract criminal investigation. Rachel watched her quietly. Your husband may not realize how exposed these transactions make him. Valerie nodded once. He believed they wouldn't be traced. Rachel smiled faintly. Most people who move money through small corporate entities believe the same thing. Later that week, Rachel prepared the next step of their strategy. A formal hearing where the newly discovered evidence would be presented to the court. Meanwhile, Austin Underwood had begun to feel the pressure. Bradley Knox sat across from him inside a private conference room at Knox's law office. The table was covered with copies of the same financial records Rachel had received. Knox tapped one page sharply. You didn't disclose this account. Austin shifted in his chair. It's a business account. Knox leaned forward. It's a business account funded by transfers from your company's municipal project payments. Austin frowned. That's still company money. Knox's voice lowered. Not if those funds were moved outside the company's official accounting structure. Austin looked away. Knox continued. Why wasn't this disclosed during financial discovery? Austin hesitated. I didn't think it mattered. Knox closed the folder slowly. It matters. Austin rubbed his forehead. What happens now? Knox exhaled quietly. We respond carefully. Austin looked up. How we argue that A Holdings LLC is a legitimate holding entity connected to real estate investment. Austin nodded slowly. That's true. Knox's expression remained skeptical. But the payments to Lena Whitmore complicate that explanation. Austin didn't respond. Knox flipped to another page, and the consulting payments to subcontractors raise additional questions. Austin leaned back. So what are you saying? Knox looked directly at him. I'm saying the judge is going to examine this very closely. Austin's confidence faded slightly. But it's still just a divorce case. Knox did not answer immediately. Finally, he said, at the moment, yes. 3 days later, the courtroom filled again. Rachel, Bennett, and Valerie sat at their table reviewing the documents one final time. Across the room, Austin appeared more tense than before. Lena Whitmore was present again, seated quietly behind him. Judge Nathaniel Underwood entered the courtroom with the same calm authority he carried every day. Be seated. Rachel stood. Your Honor, we are prepared to present financial evidence obtained through the court's discovery order. Nathaniel nodded. Proceed. Rachel approached the bench and handed the first document to the court clerk. This record shows transfers from Underwood Contracting's municipal project account into a private entity controlled by the respondent. Another document followed. And these transfers demonstrate that those funds were later distributed to Miss Lena Whitmore. Rachel continued presenting the timeline Valerie had carefully constructed. Emails, bank transfers, lease payments. Each document placed calmly before the court. Austin sat rigidly beside Bradley Knox. Behind him, Lena's confidence from earlier hearings had disappeared completely. She stared down at the table in front of her. Judge Underwood reviewed each document in silence. The courtroom remained completely still. When Rachel finished, Nathaniel closed the file slowly. He looked toward Bradley Knox. Counsel, do you wish to respond? Knox stood. But for the first time since the case began, his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Your Honor, we will require additional time to review these materials. Nathaniel nodded once. That would be advisable. The quiet words carried a meaning everyone in the room understood. The case had changed. What began as a divorce dispute had now entered a different territory, and the evidence Valerie Underwood had patiently gathered was only beginning to speak. By the time the next hearing approached, the case had quietly shifted into unfamiliar territory. What had begun as a divorce dispute between Valerie Underwood and Austin Underwood was now drawing attention from more than just family lawyers. Financial irregularities had a way of doing that. Rachel Bennett understood the change immediately after the last hearing. As she reviewed the growing collection of records, she began organizing the evidence into something far more structured than a simple divorce filing. "This isn't just about hidden marital assets anymore," she told Valerie during one of their strategy meetings. Valerie sat across from her in the conference room, the same calm expression she had carried since the beginning of the case. Rachel slid another document across the table. "This," she said, "is where the situation becomes serious." The page contained a detailed transaction report connecting several payments from Underwood Contracting to A Holdings, LLC. But Rachel had highlighted something new. Each transfer corresponded precisely with specific municipal construction payments issued by Cook County. The timeline looked almost mechanical. City payment deposited. Company operating account receives funds. Within 48 hours, a portion of that money moves into the LLC. Valerie examined the chart. "Those payments came from renovation contracts," she said quietly. Rachel nodded. "Yes, county courthouse maintenance projects, infrastructure upgrades, public contracts." Valerie's eyes moved slowly down the page. "And the consulting payments," Rachel opened another folder. "They appear to be linked to subcontractors. Several names were listed: local electrical contractors, plumbing specialists, site preparation companies. But something about the pattern was unusual. These payments, Rachel said, weren't processed through the official accounting system of the company. Valerie understood what that meant. Official subcontractor payments normally pass through standard invoices, tax reporting, and payroll documentation. The transfers through A Holdings, LLC bypassed all of that. Rachel leaned back slightly. It could indicate side agreements. Valerie raised her eyes. Or kickbacks. Rachel didn't say the word directly, but the implication hung quietly in the room. If Austin had been diverting municipal funds and redistributing them privately to contractors, the situation would extend far beyond divorce court. Rachel closed the folder. "For now, our responsibility remains focused on the divorce proceedings." Valerie nodded. But both women understood something important. The evidence was beginning to suggest financial misconduct that might attract attention from investigators. Meanwhile, Austin Underwood was experiencing the consequences of those discoveries. His office at Underwood Contracting had become noticeably quieter in recent weeks. Employees still moved through the building as usual, but the atmosphere had changed. Rumors traveled quickly in business environments. Several staff members had already heard about the divorce case appearing in court records. Some had seen the hearing dates listed online. Others had noticed the absence of Lena Whitmore from the office. Lena had quietly stopped appearing at the company 2 weeks earlier. Officially, she was working remotely. In reality, she had moved into the downtown apartment Austin had leased through A Holdings, LLC. The arrangement no longer looked like the confident new beginning she had imagined. Late one evening inside that apartment, Lena sat on the couch watching Austin pace across the living room. He had just finished another tense phone call with Bradley Knox. "They're trying to make it look like fraud," Austin said. Lena frowned. "But it isn't." Austin ran a hand through his hair. "It's just business structuring." Lena hesitated. "But why didn't you tell the court about the LLC?" Austin stopped pacing. "Because it's not part of the marriage." Lena looked toward the windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. She had been confident when the relationship with Austin first became public. Confident that Valerie would disappear quietly from the picture. Confident that Austin's wealth and company would remain stable. But the legal documents Rachel Bennett had presented in court were beginning to suggest something different. "Do you think the judge believes them?" she asked. Austin didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, "It's just a divorce case." But his voice carried less certainty now. Back at Rachel Bennett's office, the next stage of preparation had begun. Rachel and her team spent several days organizing the financial evidence into a clear chronological presentation. Charts, transfer diagrams, bank statements. Rachel wanted the court to see the pattern clearly. Valerie assisted by reviewing each document carefully. Her financial expertise allowed her to identify connections others might miss. One afternoon, she noticed something new. "Rachel," she said quietly. Rachel looked up from her notes. "Yes," Valerie pointed to one of the subcontractor payment logs. "This contractor appears repeatedly." Rachel leaned closer. The name was Henderson Utility Services. Several payments from Ashuri Holdings LLC had been sent to the company over the past year. Rachel searched the project records. Henderson Utility Services had participated in 2 of the municipal projects Underwood Contracting had recently completed. Rachel tapped the document thoughtfully. "If these payments represent unofficial compensation," Valerie finished the thought, "it suggests side agreements outside the contract." Rachel nodded slowly. "And if that's the case, the financial transfers become extremely important." Rachel placed the document into a new folder. "For now, we'll include it in the evidence package." A few days later, the courtroom filled again. Word of the financial disputes had begun circulating among attorneys in the courthouse. Several observers sat quietly in the back rows. Judge Nathaniel Underwood entered and took his seat. "Be seated." Rachel stood. "Your Honor, we are prepared to present additional financial evidence connected to the respondent's business transactions." Nathaniel nodded. "Proceed." Rachel began outlining the financial timeline Valerie had built. She described how municipal contract payments entered Underwood Contracting's accounts, how portions of those funds moved to A Holdings LLC, and how those funds were later redistributed to Lena Whitmore and several subcontractors. As she spoke, the courtroom remained completely silent. Austin sat motionless beside Bradley Knox. Lena Whitmore watched from the back row. Judge Underwood reviewed the documents carefully. When Rachel finished, Knox stood slowly. "Your Honor, he said we believe the petitioner is attempting to reinterpret legitimate business transactions." Nathaniel listened. Knox continued. "The LLC structure was created for investment and consulting purposes." Nathaniel looked down at the chart Rachel had submitted. "These transactions originate from municipal contract funds." Knox hesitated slightly. "Yes, Your Honor," but Nathaniel raised a hand gently. "Counsel, I would recommend reviewing the financial disclosures carefully." His voice remained calm, but the courtroom understood the meaning behind the words. Knox sat down again. Austin stared forward at the table. For the first time since the case began, it had become clear that the evidence was pointing towards something far larger than personal betrayal. Valerie sat quietly beside Rachel. She did not react. She simply watched the process unfold. Because the truth she had been documenting for months was finally beginning to appear in the open, and the court was now paying attention. By the time the next court session arrived, the atmosphere surrounding the case had changed noticeably. Attorneys who practiced regularly in Cook County had begun mentioning the Underwood case in quiet conversations along courthouse hallways. Financial disputes were not uncommon in divorce proceedings, but the detailed transaction records Rachel Bennett had presented suggested something deeper, something procedural, something that touched not only private finances, but public contracts. Valerie Underwood entered the courthouse that morning with the same composed manner she had maintained since the beginning of the case. She arrived early as always and took a seat beside Rachel in the front row of the courtroom. Rachel placed a thin folder on the table between them. "Today we introduce the recording," she said quietly. Valerie nodded. The recording had been sitting in her evidence archive for weeks. She had discovered it accidentally months earlier, while organizing Austin's old project files on the company's shared server. At the time, she had simply saved it along with the other materials. Now, it had become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the entire case. Across the aisle, Austin Underwood entered the courtroom with Bradley Knox. Austin's posture looked slightly different than it had during earlier hearings. Less confident, more rigid. Behind them, Lena Whitmore took her usual seat in the back row. She wore dark sunglasses for a moment before removing them and placing them carefully in her bag. She avoided looking toward Valerie. A few minutes later, Judge Nathaniel Underwood entered the courtroom. Everyone stood, be seated. The case was called quickly. Underwood versus Underwood. Rachel rose. Your Honor, the petitioner has additional evidence to present related to the financial transfers previously discussed. Nathaniel nodded. Proceed. Rachel approached the clerk's desk and handed over the recording device. This audio file was recovered from a company server associated with Underwood Contracting. The recording was made during a private meeting between the respondent and Miss Lena Whitmore. Bradley Knox immediately stood. Your Honor, we object unless the origin of the recording can be verified. Rachel responded calmly. The file metadata confirms it was recorded on the company conference room system. Both participants were aware that internal meetings were routinely archived. Nathaniel reviewed the documentation briefly. Objection overruled. The clerk connected the recording device to the courtroom audio system. The room became very quiet. Rachel spoke softly. Please play the recording. A brief hiss of static filled the speakers. Then Austin's voice appeared. Clear, recognizable. This transfer needs to stay separate from the company accounts. Valerie listened without moving. The second voice followed. Lena Whitmore. Will anyone notice? Austin responded. Not if it goes through the LLC. There was a pause in the recording. Papers rustled faintly. Then Lena spoke again. What about the subcontractors? Austin replied calmly. They get paid through the consulting line. Another pause. And Valerie, Lena asked. Austin's answer came without hesitation. She doesn't look at the business accounts anymore. Several people in the courtroom shifted slightly in their seats. The recording continued. Lena laughed quietly. So we move the money, pay the contractors, and no one asks questions. Austin responded. That's the plan. The audio ended. Silence filled the room again. Valerie remained still beside Rachel. Across the aisle, Austin's face had gone pale. Bradley Knox stared at the table in front of him. Behind them, Lena Whitmore looked down at her hands. Rachel spoke calmly. This recording corresponds directly with the financial transfers presented in previous hearings. She placed another document before the court. The timeline shows that the conversation occurred 2 days before the first series of payments from Underwood Contracting to A Holdings LLC. Judge Nathaniel Underwood reviewed the file slowly. His expression remained composed, but the weight of the evidence was now unmistakable. Bradley Knox stood again. Your Honor, the recording reflects a private business conversation. It does not demonstrate wrongdoing. Nathaniel looked up. The respondent states that funds were intentionally separated from official company accounts. Knox hesitated. That may reflect internal business structuring. Nathaniel closed the folder carefully. Perhaps. He paused briefly before continuing. But the court will review the financial documentation associated with these transfers. Rachel sat down beside Valerie again. The courtroom remained unusually quiet. Austin leaned toward Knox and whispered something urgently. Knox responded in a low voice, though his expression suggested concern. Lena Whitmore sat frozen in the back row. The recording had removed any remaining ambiguity about the financial structure Valerie had documented. It had also confirmed something else. Austin had believed the plan was invisible. He had believed Valerie would never notice. At the bench, Judge Underwood addressed the attorneys. The court will require additional review of the financial records connected to the LLC and associated payments. He looked briefly at Bradley Knox. Counsel may wish to advise the respondent accordingly. Knox nodded stiffly. Yes, Your Honor, the judge continued. Further hearings will be scheduled once the financial review is complete. He paused again. Then he added quietly, Court is adjourned. The gavel struck. People began standing slowly. The tension in the room remained thick, even as chairs moved and papers were gathered. Rachel leaned toward Valerie. That recording changed everything. Valerie did not respond immediately. Across the courtroom, Austin remained seated for several seconds before finally standing. He did not look toward Valerie. Lena approached him cautiously. They exchanged a few words, both speaking quietly. Then Knox guided them toward the exit. Rachel watched them leave. "They're realizing now," she said. Valerie stood and gathered her documents. What Rachel answered simply, that the truth is no longer private. Valerie glanced once toward the bench where Judge Nathaniel Underwood had already exited through the private door. Then she walked toward the courtroom doors, because the evidence she had spent months assembling had finally reached the place where it mattered most. Inside the record of the court. And once evidence entered that record, it rarely disappeared. The days following the courtroom recording were unusually quiet, not peaceful, quiet. In legal cases, silence often meant preparation. Rachel Bennett spent most of that week inside her office, reviewing the financial evidence once again this time, with the added context provided by the audio recording. The timeline Valerie had created now fit together with a clarity that left little room for interpretation. The transfers, the LLC, the payments to Lena Whitmore, the unofficial contractor disbursements, and the recording itself, which had captured Austin, describing the exact structure behind the transactions. Rachel understood something important. The case had reached a tipping point. But legal proceedings did not move forward based on emotion. They moved forward based on process. So Rachel began preparing for the next hearing carefully. Meanwhile, Austin Underwood's situation was deteriorating. Inside the downtown apartment he had leased through A. Holdings, LLC, the atmosphere had become tense. The wide glass windows overlooking Chicago's skyline offered the same view Lena had once admired when Austin first showed her the apartment. At that time, the place had represented something exciting, a new life. Now the same rooms felt strangely narrow. Austin paced across the living room again, his phone still in his hand after another long conversation with Bradley Knox. "They're overreacting," Austin muttered. Lena sat on the couch watching him. Her voice was quieter than it had been weeks earlier. Bradley didn't sound like he thought that. Austin stopped pacing. "He's a lawyer, that's what they do." But Lena noticed the tension in his face. "Do you think the judge believed the recording?" Austin rubbed his forehead. "It's just a conversation." Lena hesitated. "You said the money came from municipal projects." Austin looked at her sharply. "That doesn't mean anything." But even as he spoke, his voice carried less confidence. Because Austin had begun to realize something that had never concerned him before. The evidence Valerie had collected was not emotional. It was structural. Numbers, dates, documents. Things that lawyers and judges took seriously. Across the city, Valerie Underwood remained focused on the same discipline she had maintained from the beginning. Documentation. Inside Rachel Bennett's office, the evidence file had grown into several organized binders. Valerie sat quietly reviewing them once more. Rachel looked up from her laptop. "You've been very thorough." Valerie gave a small nod. Rachel continued. The recording connected everything. Valerie looked toward the stack of financial charts on the table. It confirmed the structure. Rachel leaned back slightly. "Yes, and that structure matters." She closed one of the folders. Once financial transfers appear intentional, the legal consequences become much more serious. Valerie understood. Rachel continued. "From a divorce perspective, the situation is already clear. Your husband attempted to conceal assets and redirect marital funds." Rachel paused. "But the involvement of municipal contract payments may attract attention beyond family court." Valerie's expression did not change. Rachel studied her for a moment. "You expected that possibility?" Valerie answered calmly. "I follow financial patterns for a living." Rachel smiled faintly. "That explains the spreadsheet." Later that afternoon, Rachel's office received another communication from Bradley Knox. It was brief, a request for additional time before the next hearing. Rachel read the message carefully. "They're trying to slow the process," she told Valerie. Valerie nodded. "Why?" "Because they're reviewing the damage." The next hearing was scheduled 2 weeks later. When the day arrived, the courtroom was more crowded than usual. Several attorneys from other cases had chosen to observe quietly from the back rows. Word had spread about the unusual financial evidence appearing in the Underwood case. Valerie entered with Rachel and took her seat. Across the aisle, Austin looked noticeably different than he had during earlier hearings. His shoulders were tight. His eyes moved frequently toward Bradley Knox. Lena Whitmore sat behind them again, though this time she kept her head lowered. Judge Nathaniel Underwood entered the courtroom. "Be seated." The case was called quickly. Rachel stood first. "Your Honor, the petitioner is prepared to summarize the financial evidence already submitted to the court." Nathaniel nodded. "Proceed." Rachel walked to the center of the courtroom and began presenting the complete timeline Valerie had constructed. She moved methodically through each step: the municipal contract payments, the transfers into A Holdings LLC, the payments to Lena Whitmore, the consulting transfers to subcontractors. Finally, she referenced the audio recording that explained the structure. Rachel placed the final chart before the court. This document shows the full sequence of financial movement across all accounts. Judge Underwood studied the chart quietly. Across the aisle, Bradley Knox rose slowly. "Your Honor, the respondent acknowledges that certain financial transfers were made through the LLC." Rachel did not react. Knox continued carefully. "However, those transfers were part of legitimate business arrangements." Nathaniel looked at the chart again. "The funds originate from municipal contract payments." Knox hesitated. "Yes, Your Honor." Nathaniel's voice remained calm. "And the recording indicates that these transfers were intentionally separated from the company's official accounting structure." Knox shifted his weight slightly. "That may have been an internal business decision." Nathaniel closed the folder. The quiet sound echoed softly through the room. "Counsel," he said, "the court will review the financial evidence carefully." He paused before adding, "The implications extend beyond the dissolution of this marriage." The courtroom remained completely still. Austin looked down at the table. Lena Whitmore's hands trembled slightly in her lap. Rachel returned to her seat beside Valerie. The hearing continued briefly with scheduling details. But everyone present understood something important. The case had moved beyond the point where arguments could easily change the outcome, because the evidence had become too clear. When the hearing ended and the gavel struck the bench, people began leaving the courtroom quietly. Rachel gathered the documents. "That was the collapse," she said softly. Valerie looked toward the empty bench where the judge had been sitting only moments earlier. "What do you mean?" Rachel placed the folders into her briefcase. "The moment when the other side realizes the structure they built can no longer hold." Valerie stood. Across the room, Austin remained seated for several seconds longer before finally rising. He did not look toward Valerie. Lena stood beside him, uncertainly. And for the first time since the affair had begun, the future they had imagined together no longer looked certain at all. Because the truth once exposed had a way of removing every illusion. The final hearing was scheduled for a gray morning in early autumn. Chicago's sky carried the muted color that often settled over the city once summer had fully disappeared. The air was cooler now, and the courthouse plaza outside filled with people moving quickly through the wind. Inside the Cook County courtroom, the atmosphere felt quieter than usual. Not tense, settled. Most of the evidence had already been presented during previous hearings. The financial records, the bank transfers, and the recording had created a clear narrative that neither side had been able to fully dispute. Today's session was meant to conclude the legal process. Valerie Underwood arrived at the courthouse with Rachel Bennett shortly before the courtroom doors opened. Rachel carried a single folder far thinner than the stacks of documents that had filled their earlier meetings. "We won't need most of the evidence again," Rachel explained quietly as they took their seats. "Why?" Valerie asked. Rachel glanced across the empty courtroom. "Because the record already speaks for itself." A few minutes later, Austin Underwood entered with Bradley Knox. The difference in his posture was unmistakable now. The confident businessman who had walked into earlier hearings with relaxed shoulders and an easy smile was gone. Austin moved slowly, his attention fixed on the table where Knox was already reviewing the final documents. Behind them, Lena Whitmore entered and took a seat in the back row. Her presence had changed as well. Weeks earlier, she had carried the composure of someone certain she'd already secured her future. Now she sat quietly, hands folded tightly in her lap. She avoided looking toward Valerie. When the courtroom doors closed, the clerk announced the judge's arrival. Everyone stood. Judge Nathaniel Underwood stepped onto the bench with the same calm authority that had defined every hearing in the case. "Be seated." The case was called quickly. Underwood versus Underwood. Rachel stood beside Valerie. "Your Honor, the petitioner is prepared to proceed." Bradley Knox rose as well. "The respondent is prepared." Judge Underwood opened the case file slowly. For several moments, he reviewed the documents again in silence. The courtroom remained completely still. Valerie watched him carefully, though his expression revealed nothing beyond professional concentration. Nathaniel Underwood had presided over hundreds of cases during his career. Personal matters never appeared in his decisions, only evidence. Finally, he closed the file. "This court has reviewed the financial documentation submitted during discovery," he said. His voice carried the calm precision that had become familiar to every attorney in the room. "The record demonstrates that significant funds originating from Underwood Contracting were transferred to an entity known as A Holdings LLC. He paused briefly. "These transfers occurred during the course of the marriage and were not disclosed during the respondent's initial financial filings." Bradley Knox remained silent beside Austin. Judge Underwood continued. "The court also reviewed the audio recording submitted during the previous hearing." Valerie kept her eyes on the bench. In that recording, the respondent described a plan to separate financial transactions from official company accounts. The judge turned a page slowly. Based on the documentation presented, the court finds that marital assets were intentionally concealed. A quiet murmur moved through the observers seated in the back of the courtroom. Judge Underwood continued without acknowledging it. "The dissolution of marriage between Valerie Underwood and Austin Underwood is hereby granted." Valerie felt the words settle over the room. 9 years of marriage ended in a single sentence. But the judge had not finished. Regarding the financial matters presented during these proceedings, Nathaniel paused briefly before continuing. "The court orders a full accounting of the assets held by A Holdings LLC and any associated financial transfers." Austin's shoulders tightened. Judge Underwood's voice remained steady. "The respondent is required to return all funds determined to be marital assets." Rachel Bennett made a quiet note beside Valerie. Then the judge added one more statement. "The court will forward the financial documentation connected to municipal contract payments to the appropriate investigative authorities for further review." The meaning of the sentence moved through the courtroom slowly. Austin lowered his eyes to the table. Lena Whitmore's hands tightened around the strap of her bag. Judge Underwood closed the file. "This court's responsibility in the dissolution matter is complete." He looked briefly across the courtroom. "The judgment is entered." The gavel struck. The sound was sharp, but not dramatic. Just the ordinary sound of a case reaching its legal conclusion. People began standing quietly as the hearing ended. Rachel leaned toward Valerie. "That's it," she said softly. Valerie nodded once. Across the aisle, Austin remained seated for a moment longer before finally standing beside Bradley Knox. Knox spoke to him quietly, though the words were impossible to hear. Lena approached cautiously. She spoke to Austin in a low voice. Austin did not respond. For the first time since the relationship had begun, the future they had imagined together seemed uncertain, because the legal structure surrounding them had changed completely. Valerie gathered her documents calmly. Rachel placed the final folder into her briefcase. "Are you ready to go?" she asked. "Yes." They walked toward the courtroom doors. As Valerie stepped into the hallway, the noise of the courthouse returned around them. Voices, footsteps, the quiet movement of another day's cases continuing. The legal process had ended. But Valerie knew something else. The courtroom had only revealed the truth. It had not celebrated it, and it had not humiliated anyone. The law rarely did. It simply recorded what the evidence showed. And today the evidence had been clear. The courthouse hallway felt quieter once the hearing ended. Not empty courthouses were never truly empty, but quieter in the way a place becomes calm after something important has already happened. Valerie Underwood stepped out of the courtroom beside Rachel Bennett, the sound of the closing door fading behind them. Lawyers and clerks moved through the corridor carrying files and speaking in low voices about other cases waiting to be heard. Life inside the building continued exactly as it always had. But Valerie knew that something significant in her own life had just concluded. Rachel paused near the large windows overlooking the street below. "Well," she said softly, "that chapter is finished." Valerie nodded. Yes. Rachel studied her client carefully. Over the past several months, she had watched Valerie navigate one of the most emotionally complicated legal processes many people ever faced. But Valerie had never raised her voice, never argued in the courtroom, never attempted to humiliate Austin or Lena. Instead, she had simply documented the truth and allowed the legal system to examine it. Rachel respected that. "Most people in your position would have reacted very differently," Rachel said. Valerie looked toward the street outside where traffic moved steadily through the downtown intersection. "I didn't need to react," she replied. Rachel smiled slightly. "No," she said, "you didn't." They walked together toward the elevator lobby. A few reporters stood near the far end of the hallway, speaking quietly with another attorney from an unrelated case. The Underwood proceedings had remained relatively private, despite the financial complexity involved. Rachel pressed the elevator button. "Once the final asset review is completed," she said, "we'll close the remaining financial details." Valerie nodded. "And after that," Rachel shrugged gently, "after that, you move on." The elevator doors opened. As Valerie stepped inside, she noticed two familiar figures approaching the lobby behind them. Austin Underwood and Lena Whitmore. Austin looked exhausted now. The confident businessman who had once believed he controlled every part of his future had disappeared completely. His shoulders were heavy, his eyes fixed on the floor as he walked. Lena followed a few steps behind him. Neither of them spoke. For a moment, the four of them stood together in the elevator. No one addressed the others. The silence felt different now, not tense, resolved. The elevator descended slowly through the floors of the courthouse. When the doors opened at the ground level, Austin stepped out first. Lena followed him toward the exit without looking back. Rachel glanced toward Valerie. "You handled that well," she said quietly. Valerie gave a small nod, because the truth was simple. There was nothing left to say. Outside the courthouse, the cool autumn air moved gently through the plaza. The city continued its usual rhythm, cars passing, people crossing the street, the distant sound of construction somewhere further downtown. Rachel extended her hand. "If you ever need anything else, you know where to find me." Valerie shook it. "Thank you." Rachel walked toward the parking garage, leaving Valerie standing alone near the courthouse steps. For several minutes, Valerie remained there, watching the city move around her. Then she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Valerie." She turned. Judge Nathaniel Underwood stood near the edge of the plaza. Without his judicial robe, he looked less like the distant figure who had presided over the courtroom and more like the older brother she had known since childhood. Nathaniel approached slowly. Neither of them spoke immediately. Finally, he said, "You handled yourself well." Valerie looked at him. "So did you." Nathaniel gave a faint nod. Inside the courtroom, he had never allowed even the smallest sign that the woman seated beside Rachel Bennett was his sister. That discipline had been necessary. And Valerie had expected nothing less. They walked slowly across the plaza together. "I wanted to ask you something," Nathaniel said after a moment. Valerie waited. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" Valerie looked toward the courthouse building behind them. "Because it wasn't your role." Nathaniel considered that answer. "You could have asked for advice." Valerie shook her head gently. "You already taught me the most important advice." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow slightly. What was that? Valerie's voice remained calm. "That evidence matters more than emotion." Nathaniel smiled faintly. It was a rare expression for him. "I suppose I did say that once." They reached the corner of the street where their paths would separate. Nathaniel paused. "What will you do now?" Valerie thought about the question for a moment. The answer was surprisingly simple. "I'll go back to work," she said. Nathaniel nodded. "That sounds like you." They stood quietly for another second before Nathaniel spoke again. "If you ever need anything." Valerie shook her head gently. "I know." Nathaniel gave a final nod. Then he turned and walked back toward the courthouse. Valerie remained at the corner for a moment longer. The city stretched out around her, the river, the buildings, the endless movement of people going about their ordinary lives. The past months had been complicated, painful in ways she had not expected. But the conclusion had not come through anger or revenge. It had come through patience, through documentation, through the quiet decision to allow truth to speak for itself. Valerie turned and began walking down the sidewalk. The autumn wind moved softly through the streets of Chicago. Behind her, the courthouse doors opened and closed as another group of people entered to face their own legal battles. But Valerie did not look back. She simply continued forward. Because the most important thing about dignity was not how someone won. It was how they chose to leave. The story of Valerie Underwood was never really about revenge. It was about something quieter than that. For months, she watched carefully while the people around her believed they were untouchable. She didn't argue. She didn't expose them immediately. She simply gathered the truth piece by piece until the evidence was strong enough to stand on its own. In the end, the courtroom didn't need drama. It needed facts. The documents spoke. The financial records spoke. Even a single conversation recorded months earlier spoke clearly enough. And when the truth finally appeared, Valerie didn't celebrate. She didn't humiliate anyone. She simply walked away. Because dignity is rarely loud. It's quiet. If you've stayed with the story until the end, you probably understand something about that kind of strength. I'd be curious to know where you're watching from today. Tell me in the comments what city or country you're in and what time it is there right now. Stories like this travel far, and it's always fascinating to see how many different places people are listening from. And if stories about justice, patience, and quiet strength resonate with you, you're always welcome here. You can leave a like. If this story stayed with you, you can share your thoughts below. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, you can subscribe so the next story finds you when it arrives. Sometimes the most powerful endings are the quiet ones. And sometimes, walking away is the strongest decision anyone can make.